Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a magical place for kids and grown-ups alike, where fantasy and fun come to life. Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for feelings you may experience while listening to this new company update, so please hold any comments and concerns until the end of the mandatory company-wide notice. And as always, remember to smile. You are the face of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza.
You know what's always bothered me in FNAF? Golden Freddy.
Leave me alone! Akira!
Don't worry, this theory won't be about who the vengeful spirit is. I don't want to open a giant can of worms today. I mostly just want to discuss the crying child and the Golden Freddy animatronic himself. The theory I'll be giving my 2 cents on today is called ShatterVictim, and in a general sense is the idea that the soul of the crying child was somehow and at some point shattered among either the entire franchise of Freddy's as a whole, or just between the main 5 animatronics in FNAF 1. So, with the basic introduction of the theory out of the way, let's take a look at what questions ShatterVictim seeks to answer and why we asked them in the first place. From everything I've seen about ShatterVictim, which I'll be forthfront and say that I've never been too fond of the idea, so I actually never watched too much into it, but from what I can tell at a base level, it seeks to solve why Happiest Day seems to revolve around the Golden Freddy spirit specifically, with it seeming to be necessary to help the Golden Freddy kid put back together his pieces, as FNAF World says, in order to make Happiest Day possible, which is not only the release of the Golden Freddy spirit, but all of the spirits. The question then arises of what makes you so special, in regards to the Golden Freddy spirit. Why did the other spirits seem to not be able to move on until he or she has, depending on who you think the receiver of Happiest Day is? And on that note, who is the receiver? FNAF 1 through 3 didn't originally have the crying child, so it would make sense for it to be the 5th victim of the MCI, Cassidy, although the clock ending in FNAF World seems to insinuate that the pieces are there for the crying child, meaning he would be the receiver. Is Cassidy just the crying child? Is Andrew the vengeful spirit? Is the crying child Dave? Is Cassidy the vengeful spirit? Are there even 2 spirits inside Golden Freddy? To answer all of these with a non-answer, I don't really think any of these questions about who the spirit in Happiest Day is are ones I want to delve into today. As mentioned before, I more so want to provide a possible explanation for the shattering of the victim that I haven't seen proposed before. And as such, you can feel free to apply it to any character you choose to see as the one in Happiest Day. But before I go into my thoughts on how I believe the shattering might have happened, I want to go over some community beliefs on how it's possible and give my thoughts on those interpretations. For the most part, people seem to think that the shattering of the Golden Freddy spirit is tied to agony in some way, with variations on how exactly it happened. The first version of the theory I'll be going into today is the version that states that Charlie somehow split the memories of the crying child amongst all the other animatronics, presumably during Give Gifts, Give Life. Now, from what I can tell, this theory is derived from the fact that Happiest Day minigames all have connections to things seen in the daytime minigames in FNAF 4. The Mangle minigames relate to the Mangle toy seen in the sister's room. The Chica minigame relates to the toy Chica missing her beak next to one of the children seen outside. Stage 01 relates to Fredbear's itself, etc. And as we know that Charlie was the one who presumably set up Happiest Day in FNAF 3, the idea would follow that the act of putting the crying child back together is the act of setting up the pieces of his memories, which is supported by FNAF World's clock ending relating to Happiest Day minigames as well. I believe from this point the logic follows that since Charlie was the one putting the pieces together, she may have also been the one to split them apart, although likely not on purpose. From my understanding, it would seem possible that Charlie might have used the remnant or agony from the crying child in an attempt to revive the other kids during Give Gifts. This would also be supported and tie into the Candy Cadet story where he says,
"Now I will tell you a story about a young woman who was sealed in a small room. In the room was a furnace, and 5 keys. She was told that each of the 5 keys would unlock one of 5 doors outside her room. Inside each room was a child that she could take with her as she fled the building. But she was only allowed to leave her own room with 1 key, not all 5. Desperate to find a way to save all 5 children, the woman melted the 5 keys together in the furnace to create a single key, hoping it would unlock all 5 doors. Of course, it did not work that way. Now her key opened none of the doors. Rather than leaving her room with a key to 1 life, she had taken with her the key to 5 deaths."
I may be wrong in my understanding of this theory, but as far as I can tell, this is what's being proposed in this version of ShatterVictim. Next up, we have the theory that the crying child's remnant or agony bled into his plushes, likely in a very similar way to the way we see the Charlie bots possessed by Charlie in the Silver Ice novel, where we see the actual thing that constitutes the Charlie bots is a small Ella doll that became quote-unquote possessed after Henry poured his grief of losing Charlie into it. And so the idea would follow that either the plushes were representations of the characters as a whole, and so the animatronics representing the characters were connected and possessed by the crying Child through his agony and fear of the animatronics themselves, or through his remnant and love of the characters they represent. Alternatively, the plushes themselves became possessed in a parallel to the novel trilogy because of the deep fondness he felt for them, and each were at some point and for some reason either inserted or combined with the animatronics they represent. After this, we have the theory that the Crying Child felt such fear for the Freddy's franchise and was so tormented by his family that he shed his memories of the entire franchise amongst everything, resulting in everything within Freddy's containing pieces of the Crying Child, with supporting evidence from the novels where Marla mentions she sometimes feels like she has moments where she feels like she forgets things, whether it be positive or negative, and concludes that it's possible that everyone is constantly shedding things like fear and regret and hope everywhere they go, and other people catching glimpses of these sheddings is what would be considered a ghost. And since the Crying Child seems to have experienced nothing but misery every day of his life until his death by his own family, he would have a lot of negative feelings and memories to shed amongst everything he ever interacted with, shattering his essence upon his death. For more information on this version of the theory, check out Raito's theory linked in the description. There's also the theory proposed by Shizui, where he proposes that the Crying Child actually physically lost a piece inside the Fredbear after the bite, as the bite of 87 and 83 are heavily tied together, and we know that the bite of 87 victim lost his frontal lobe, and as such physically separated the pieces of the Crying Child that needed to be put back together to reform his spirit as well. I recommend you check out its full video for more context surrounding it. After this, we have the famous God Victim proposed by the fantastic T-Dreads. God Victim proposes that the things we see in FNAF 4 that relate to aspects outside of 4, such as the bite of 83 versus 87 tease for FNAF 4, Toy Chica missing its beak, the Mangle toy, are things that originated first within the experiences of the Crying Child during the daytime minigames of FNAF 4, and after his death he ends up altering his surroundings as time goes on to match with his memories, with evidence of his ability to alter things showed by the altered text in the survival logbook and the changing pictures and posters and paper plate pals. And so things like Toy Chica removing her beak are actually the Crying Child altering his surroundings to fit his memories of the Chica toy missing its beak. To go along with this, we know that Golden Freddy is in the FNAF 2 location, which would be the reason that the Crying Child would have the ability to influence Toy Chica, because she's part of his surroundings. Personally, I also think the FNAF 2 location is the Fredbear's location remodeled, and so the things from his memories appearing in the FNAF 2 location would be him influencing, not necessarily purposefully I should add, the people and environment around him to match it with his memories. Now, before I give my thoughts on each of these theories, I want to go over some evidence from the games and books that would indicate ShatterVictim. I'll start by listing the game evidences of a shattering having occurred, and then I'll list each book and what evidence it contains to indicate ShatterVictim. Starting out in FNAF 3, we have several minigames that surround setting up aspects of Happiest Day that revolve around the Crying Child. In this context, separated from the Crying Child we know because the game would come before we receive the character in full during FNAF 4, and depending on the beliefs you might hold about the spirit that inhabit Golden Freddy, and who the receiver in FNAF 3 is, it could be Cassidy or Dave or Cassidy again, but this time as the name of the Crying Child. It all gets confusing, which is why I'm avoiding the receiver aspect for now. Regardless, it seems necessary for things relating to other characters to happen in order to set up Happiest Day for the Golden Freddy spirit, indicating a connection, which would be the shattering under this interpretation. Next up, in FNAF 4, we see the things set up in Happiest Day represented in the daytime minigames that the Crying Child goes through before the big bite, with the positioning of the bite victim and the bullies wearing masks being in an exact flip from the character seen in Happiest Day, indicating Happiest Day is essentially the good ending for the Crying Child himself. Then, in FNAF World, we see a character, Glitchbear, telling the player to do things that set up the minigames seen in FNAF 3 that lead to Happiest Day, with the ending saying the pieces are in place, indicating that FNAF World is setting up Happiest Day for the Crying Child. All in all, we see that the things needed to allow the Crying Child to move on are pieces that need to be put together. Now, let's take a look at some of the possible evidences for the shattering that exist within the books. The Silver Eyes trilogy is where we receive a lot of imagery of people's memories and emotions being shed and left behind in the places they go, with examples being things such as Charlie feeling the memories left behind in the house her father Henry lived in upon entering it. There's a lot of general imagery throughout the books of the ideas of emotions being shed and absorbed into the surroundings as memories, which fits with the general themes of ShatterVictim. There are also several examples of things from the anthology series of both Fazbear Frights and also Tales from the Pizzaplex which could be interpreted in a way that would indicate ShatterVictim. I won't go into complete detail for each one of these, but I'll do my best to speedrun summarize the general evidences from them.
Ready?
The stories To Be Beautiful from Fazbear Frights and Frailty from Tales from the Pizzaplex both revolve around a pendant, a heart in the Fright story, and an already almost used up similar pendant in Frailty. However, with it being almost gone due to Jessica shaving pieces of it to heal others, we aren't sure of what the pendant originally looked like. However, the near identical properties and general descriptions of the pendants lead me to believe it's either meant to be the same pendant in the same continuity, or the same pendant but in a separate continuity. Regardless, the pendant is a silver heart, and so could be seen as representative of the soul of the person who wears wears it. In To Be Beautiful, as Sarah loses the pendant, she starts falling apart and turning into different pieces of machinery. And the same happens with Jessica as she shaves the pendant into slivers to heal others and sacrifices her own body in the process, which could be indicative of the idea of someone's soul being broken into different pieces. Personally, I'm not super convinced of this specifically, however, it could potentially be used as a supporting evidence. The story Dance With Me has the protagonist Casey expressing the feelings of changing and breaking apart. In The Flesh has Springtrap's AI blown apart and spread across the entirety of the code. The Man in Room 1280 infamously has William and therefore also Andrew explode and infect several things inside a Fazbear warehouse. The Real Jake has language describing Margie trying to hold herself together, while also having Jake seemingly possess a doll that he was fond of that was out of reach and sight. Similarly, The Cliffs has a character, Robert, express difficulty with holding on to himself after a tragedy, and also of him being unsure of whether he'd be able to put himself back together if he broke down. Sea Bonnie's has a more literal reading, much like To Be Beautiful and Frailty, where the main character's flesh is slowly replaced by Sea Bonnie's until he literally falls apart. However, at the same time expresses that his thoughts and memories were also falling apart, not just his body. The story Kids at Play has a character expressing feelings of fragmenting and disconnecting from himself. GGY has Gregory, who is often seen as a crying child stand-in, recoding the main band of animatronics while leaving traces of himself, G's and Y's, throughout the code. There are also the epilogues from Fazbear Frights, such as from 1:35 AM, where Taggart explains that the human emotion emanates from a person like a noxious cloud and soaks into the surrounding. Step Closer is where we learn Andrew wanted to infect everything he threw his anger at, etc., etc. There seems to be instances or imagery of people falling apart and infecting their surroundings throughout every book series FNAF has, and since it's such a common theme, it would seem indicative of something trying to be expressed to the audience. Now, with the general evidences for something akin to ShatterVictim seeming to be present in some way, I'd like to go over the community interpretations and give my thoughts on them. Starting out with the idea that Charlie somehow and for some reason, potentially, not even purposefully, split the crying child apart while giving gifts and life to the other animatronics, I do agree with the idea of Charlie seeming to have something to do with putting the crying child back together, as the puppet is the one who serves cake and happiest day, indicating a significance with the puppet's relationship to the memories of the Golden Freddy spirit. However, I disagree with the idea of the puppet having been the one to shatter the crying child. There are connections to draw from, such as the Candy Cadet story about a young girl melting 5 keys in an attempt to make one that saves everyone, and instead dooming them all by mistake. However, there just isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that what the puppet is specifically doing in Give Gifts would be shattering the Golden Freddy spirit, intentionally or not. It begs the question of what is actually going on in Give Gifts. The puppet using Remnant from Golden Freddy to try and save everyone? Maybe, however, we don't see evidence of this. It's a speculation that exists based on a speculation that the puppet could have been the one to shatter the spirit. Again, I don't think it's completely without merit, but it just seems less likely to me. Next up, we have the plush theory. This theory I think has a lot of merit in regards to the act of the plushes themselves becoming possessed through his agony, as we're shown almost the exact same situation in both the Silver Eyes and also the Real Jake. However, where it starts to become less likely for me is the speculation that the plushes were somehow incorporated into the animatronics or went on to infect the restaurant as a whole. We have one thing that seems likely, the animatronics in buildings seem affected by the crying child, and another thing that seems likely, the plushes may have become infected with his agony, and fabricating a connection to create an answer that satisfies the proposed question of how he was shattered. There just isn't anything to indicate that the plushes would go on to have significance in the story within the games themselves. I don't dislike the evidence used. There is very much merit to the plushes becoming infected, however, I do dislike the conclusion drawn from the evidence. After this, we have the theory that the crying child's perpetual agony soaked into things throughout the franchise, creating his presence among most things we see in the games. I think this one has a lot of very strong evidence, especially considering this is exactly how Dr. Taggart explains the mechanics behind agony. The only issue I hold with this theory is how it seems to have affected the things past Fredbears. I fully believe we could solidly draw this conclusion to things within the surroundings he was in, however, we are never shown or told that the crying child would have visited Freddy's at all, or at the very least frequently enough to infect things within it. We see the crying child is fond of the characters, saying that they are his friends, however, the implied reason for being around Fredbear so much is because of its proximity to his house, and if we're working under the assumption that William is his father and owned the location, I don't see why William would want to frequently go out of his way to take him to a different restaurant when he has a perfectly fine one practically connected to his house, especially given how little it seems William actually cares for the kid. It's his birthday week, and is even at the location William would actively be at, as we see see the purple guy shooting up employees, and yet he never directly interacts with the kid, even on the day of his birthday. All in all, it's a very solid theory. I just don't personally see how the crying child's influence would be seen outside of Fredbear's under this interpretation. Next, we have the idea that the crying child was actually physically shattered, losing a piece of himself inside Fredbear and needed to be connected with the piece he lost to rest. This theory would be indicative of the crying child being spring-locked post-bite to reconnect him, to put him back together, which if you're a fan of dual process theory and Shizui, you might recognize. And despite the controversial nature of the theory, I do think it has real credence, as it's very common in general real-life ghost lore, not that I personally believe in ghosts, however, if you do, this is not meant to dismiss you, that a spirit will remain present until all pieces of it are together in one place. The issue I take with this theory in regards to ShatterVictim specifically is that it fails to explain the seeming influence of the crying child throughout the rest of the franchise. This would be more so indicative that the shattering had less presence than common interpretations would seem to suggest. Speaking of influence, this brings me to God Victim. If you haven't heard of this theory, I suggest you watch T-Dread's video linked in the description to get a better understanding of it. However, this theory gives a very good explanation for the seeming presence of the crying child everywhere. It essentially boils down to the idea that we know the crying child has the ability to alter reality, as seen with the survival logbook, changing the words on the pages, and so uses this to explain the general influences we seem to see perpetuated throughout the series originating in FNAF 4, such as the mango toy or the toy chica missing its beak, essentially claiming the crying child alters his surroundings to fit with his memories. This explains a lot of the evidences for ShatterVictim without needing the convoluted idea of the victim actually being shattered, as he would instead just be influential of his surroundings rather than being a part of them. I don't actually have much to disagree with for this theory other than the fact that it would narratively, unintentionally place a lot of the responsibility of the tragedies throughout the franchise onto the crying child, with things like the bite of 87 being influenced into happening because of the bite of 83, and would also seemingly make the crying child specifically an ultra-powered spirit with the ability to constantly manipulate the entirety of his surroundings. My preferred take on this is actually Loop Victim, proposed by Professor Petal of FNAFology, where she suggests the opposite of being true, that the things seen in the crying child memories are instead being altered by the surroundings his spirit is around, meaning the things like Toy Chica missing her beak would be because his spirit would have been looping the last week of his life for years, and as we know Golden Freddy was in the FNAF 2 location, the memory of the Chica toy in his mind changed to match with the real Toy Chica animatronic removing her beak. This would also be supported by FNAF World saying that everything that happens out there has an effect in here, with FNAF World heavily relating to the crying child and the general layout of the maps in FNAF World looking like a brain, although if you think the map is more so representative of a computer chip or just isn't meant to represent anything, that's okay. The importance is just FNAF World's relation to the crying child in general, insinuating that the events of the outside world are affecting the crying child's brain and memories. The only issue with this in regards to ShatterVictim would be that it would perfectly explain FNAF 4 in my opinion. I'm gonna glaze here for a minute. I genuinely can't think of a single flaw with Loop Victim. It's actually just right in my opinion. Please go check out FNAFology and her theory, it's so good. But it would seemingly fail to provide anything for ShatterVictim. It's a mostly closed theory. It doesn't provide a ton of insight for what we're currently trying to solve in this video. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I want to address the thing that seems to be most people's biggest hangup with ShatterVictim. It's just so overly complicated. There's so many different versions of ShatterVictim because it feels like, while we have an idea of it potentially existing, we don't have any concrete things that would lead us there naturally. Every theory on ShatterVictim seems to have a lot more speculation involved with solving it than most other theories. It seems a lot less based in the reality and rules we've seen laid out in the game specifically. Well, if these are thoughts you've had on ShatterVictim, then I have some good news for you. My goal when theorizing about this subject was to try and simplify the answer and ground it more to what we've seen previously in the games. But before I get into specifics, I need to lay some groundwork. We need to take a look at Golden Freddy himself and the other Springlock animatronic, Spring Bonnie. Looking at the information we have on the Springlocks, they're very sensitive and prone to snapping back into animatronic mode, as seen with the FNAF 3 phone calls.
For today's lesson, we will be continuing our training on proper suit handling techniques. When using an animatronic as a suit, please ensure that the animatronic parts are tightly compressed and fastened by the spring locks located around the inside of the suit. It may take a few moments to position your head and torso between these parts in a manner where you can move and speak. Try not to nudge or press against any of the spring locks inside the suit. Do not touch the spring locks at any time. Do not breathe on the spring locks, as moisture may loosen them and cause them to break loose.
And we know that when the Springlock animatronics are in show mode, they are forced to turn and walk towards sound.
First, we will discuss how to operate the mascots when they are in animatronic form. For ease of operation, the animatronics are set to turn and walk towards sound cues. This is an easy and hands-free approach to making sure the animatronics stay where the children are for maximum entertainment / crowd-pleasing value.
and it doesn't seem like this programming can be overruled, as William himself was forced to abide by it. This has always been my issue with Golden Freddy. Notice how in both examples of these rules, it's only been applied to William's suit and not Golden Freddy? There's a popular theory that it's possible that the vengeful spirit was killed via spring locking, or in other words, the animatronic shifting into show mode over suit mode. And yet we never see the Golden Freddy animatronic actually be an animatronic, except in FNAF 4. If the victim was spring locked, it should have put the suit into animatronic mode, and I doubt a child getting in the way of the endoskeleton would stop it, since it didn't stop a fully grown adult man. So what gives? Why do we never see Golden Freddy as an animatronic? We see the twitching in Ultimate Custom Night looking the same as William's spring locking, indicating it's going into show mode, but then does nothing ever. If Golden Freddy has the power to influence its surroundings, why wouldn't the vengeful spirit put itself into animatronic mode so that it can more directly attack William and the Night Guards? Well, that's where my theory on ShatterVictim comes into play, and grounds it in the basis of mechanics we've already seen in the games. I'd like to suggest that the reason the Golden Freddy animatronic is only ever a suit is because it's missing either most or all of its endoskeleton. Now, aside from a lack of physical action from Golden Freddy, what do I believe could suggest this? Well, John FNAF in one of his videos previously pointed out that Circus Baby and Golden Freddy strike a near identical pose at one point in the sister location, and I believe John uses this to theorize that Circus Baby could have been a springlock suit. However, I'd like to suggest the inverse. We know that Circus Baby is missing its Funtime endoskeleton at this point in time, and I believe this could be trying to suggest that the other animatronic we see in this identical pose is also missing its endoskeleton. Well, if that's true, what happened to it, and how does this relate to ShatterVictim? Well, let's take a look at the Wizards. Now, admittedly, I'll say that this theory holds a lot less water if you believe that the toy animatronics are either possessed by the DCI or not possessed at all. But in my interpretation, the toy animatronics are being possessed by pieces of the Wizards, as Ralph directly mentions that they are indeed using parts from them.
By now I'm sure you've noticed the older models sitting in the back room. Those are from the previous location, and we just use them for parts now.
And we know from Mangle existing in the same game that it's mentioned, that breaking an animatronic apart and adding new pieces to it, as evidenced by Mangle's multiple endoskeleton heads and limbs, doesn't remove the possession from the animatronic.
But kids these days just can't keep their hands to themselves. The staff literally had to put Foxy back together at the end of every shift. So eventually they just stopped trying and left him in some kind of take apart, put back together attraction. Now he's just a mess of parts. I think the employees refer to him as just the Mangle,
indicating that the toys are indeed possessed by the endoskeletons from the Wizards. However, if we take a look at the Wizards, we can see that for the most part, all of them still contain a majority of their endoskeletons. Chica is missing her arms, and Bonnie is missing an arm and a face, but Freddy and Foxy appear largely untouched, and it would be strange to insinuate that the toys are only possessed by tiny pieces of Bonnie and Chica. But there's actually one more Withered I've failed to mention. Withered Golden Freddy. The spare suit in the back. Notice how Ralph says suit specifically? I believe it's already missing its endoskeleton. I'd like to propose here today, dear Fazbear Entertainment customers and employees, that they use the endoskeleton of Golden Freddy to try and repair the Wizards.
The idea at first was to repair them.
As we know, using parts splits the soul amongst the things it's added to, so the act of putting the endoskeleton of Golden Freddy into the Wizards would shatter the soul of the crying child into the main four animatronics, creating a much more streamlined and simple version for ShatterVictim than I've seen previously suggested. Now, I want to be clear, this explanation is not without flaws, and I'd like to go over some of those flaws with you, so if you end up having any ideas for solutions to these issues, let me know in the comments. The first main problem with this theory is that under Golden Duo, or the idea that the crying child and vengeful spirit are separate spirits and both within Golden Freddy, this would imply that the vengeful spirit was also shattered, as they would be connected to the Golden Freddy animatronic as well. The issue with this is that there wouldn't be any evidence of the vengeful spirit being shattered, unless we use Fazbear Frights as parallels and say that Andrew was shattered amongst the things within the Fazbear Distribution Center. Speaking of Andrew, this could also potentially solve the issue, as if Andrew was the vengeful spirit and was unrelated to Golden Freddy, then this would fix that aspect. But then if you believe that Cassidy was still a victim of the MCI and in Golden Freddy, then you would have both her and the crying child being shattered, which leads back to the issue that nothing seems to suggest anyone except the crying child was shattered. If you believe in something akin to dual process in Shizui, however, then this could again work, as the crying child would be considered one of the victims of the MCI, and so would fall under the Golden Uno theory that there's only one spirit in Golden Freddy, allowing him to be shattered without issue. Aside from this, there's nothing really to indicate my version of the theory specifically. It's a speculation speculation based on other speculations about ShatterVictim. But where I think my version stands out is that it's very grounded in examples of soul-splitting we see in the games, such as the Fun Times if you believe Molten MCI, or the toy animatronics if you believe Toys MCI. Now, something I want to do with all of my theories going forward is give insight on how this would affect the narrative, because one thing I think we all as a community struggle with sometimes is hyper-focusing on the details and missing the story in the process. ShatterVictim as a narrative would mean that most of FNAF revolves around the story of the crying child specifically. He's not only the one to have started everything, if you believe in the Bite of 83 being the first event in the franchise, but it would continue to hold his influence over the entirety of the series. It would essentially symbolize Mike's mistake in taking the joke too far and killing his brother, casting a shadow over the entirety of the series, as presumably we follow Mike's perspective through the story. The actions of his past haunt him everywhere he goes, and wouldn't you know it, but once we have Mike no longer being the player, such as with Help Wanted as Security Breach, the influence of the crying child would for the most part seem to have disappeared. There are clearly still references, but as Mike fades out of the story, so too does his brother. With all that being said, I don't think there's much more I can say about the topic. If you have any ideas or thoughts about ShatterVictim, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'll be making my glitch trap video next, so subscribe to Fazbear Entertainment to promote yourself from a customer to an employee, and receive notifications for when we post new company-wide mandatory updates. Thank you for watching.
This is the end of the company-wide mandatory update. We hope you enjoyed your stay here. Employees will be asked to leave comments and concerns in the space provided below this video. Please subscribe to Fazbear Entertainment to receive more company news, and remember to smile. You are the face of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza.